Why is there so much misinformation on saturation and distortion? And at what point does saturation become distortion? The answer to these questions can and most likely would make you change your approach when applying it to an audio source. And that is why we are here today, to break down the true meaning of the two. But it would be a shame to go over these and not describe the difference between, let's say, an overdrive and a fuzz. All of these terms we've become familiar with, but might not necessarily understand what's going on under the hood. By the end of this video, we will have a valid understanding of the differences between them and why the lines have been blurred. So what's happening, fam? Miami here with JST, and the T is for tones. Fuzz, overdrive, saturation, and distortion are all tools that we use to help us shape tones. From slightly shaving off waveforms to shaving them off as hard as possible with a fuzz. Not gonna lie, the mustache ain't really a good look for me. I got some fuzz I gotta shave off myself. But at which point did the confusion come in, and what relation do they all have to clipping? As a kid, I was trying to figure out how to get the perfect guitar distortion on my uncle's guitar while the other kids were playing thumb war. I actually invite you to have a thumb war with me right now by hitting that like button. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified when we drop new content. That transition really was kind of crazy. All right, so the too long didn't read version. When a girl is upset, it's saturation. When she's pissed off, it's distortion. But let's get to a more scientific answer. If you saw my video, reverb versus delay, you might remember that I stated that echoes and reverbs are all a variation of delay. Well, overdrives, fuzz, and saturation are all just a variation of distortion. Distortion is what happens when you overload a circuit in the analog world. Transistor game, still crazy. Another thing we have to realize is not all distortion is good distortion. There's bad distortion too, right? It all comes down to the point at which we decide that a specific amount of an effect deserves its own name. What is audio saturation? The answer I want to say is what's happening in the music industry, but that's not why we're here today. Audio saturation was the result of pushing analog tape levels too far. At one point, this was looked at as taboo, but engineers soon began to realize the pleasant effect of tape saturation and decided to start doing it to shape their audio sources. Remember how earlier I said that these forms of distortion all have something to do with clipping? Well, saturation is the result of soft clipping, a much more rounded version of clipping than hard clipping. We're all just trying to find someone that turns our software into hardware. Okay, so what soft clipping means is instead of chopping off the waveform as it peaks over a threshold, it's compressing it. The result of this is also creating overtones or even harmonics. More on that later. Try to think of it as an optocomp here because it has the characteristics of a slow compression, since fast compressors are usually known to have, distortion at some point. And since this is the world of analog that we're talking about, the results are non-linear. So remember the big takeaway of audio saturation. Soft clipping in the fact that it's non-linear. Audio saturation is best for fattening up a signal, especially low end, and is the most versatile form of distortion. This is mainly because it's the most forgiving. And lastly, saturation doesn't wildly change the main characteristics of your audio source. On to overdrive. Overdrive is the Goldilocks of amp distortion. That sentence has never been said before, and I'm glad to be the one to claim it. This is mostly used in the world of guitar amps and pedals, and it's right in the middle for the amount of distortion being applied. There is clean distortion that happens to your audio being passed no matter what you do, which I consider the first level. Overdrive is when it's being pushed, and of course there is the obvious level of distortion that we all know and love. So if you think of saturation in the world of soft clipping and distortion in the world of hard clipping, put overdrive in the class of saturation. The reason I say this is because they're both soft clipping and not extremely exaggerating the character of the audio source. People often get overdrive pedals and boost pedals confused, but in reality a traditional boost pedal doesn't add any actual distortion to your signal because it's not actually clipping anything. There are a lot of things I'm trying to break down this episode. The terminology for this stuff is just all over the place, but we're gonna get to the bottom of it. The reason people might reach for an overdrive over a boost is because of the harmonic content. Now there are odd harmonics and even harmonics. These are the multiples of the frequencies of the signal that are being affected. So imagine your source is 200 hertz on a sine wave. Your even harmonics would then be 400, 600, 800, and so on. Even harmonics are the result of soft clipping. So yes, this happens with saturation as well, but I tend to refer to them as overtones. But I'll never truly be overtones. I got jokes. So the big takeaways from overdrive are it's basically the saturation of the guitar amp world. The Goldilocks of amp distortion has even order harmonics as a result of soft clipping. Also, the overtone or even harmonics are generally more noticeable than saturation. Now let's get into some more confusion. Distortion versus distortion. What we all think of when we hear the word distortion versus what distortion actually means. Because technically, everything we've talked about so far is distortion. But when we talk about distortion in audio, it's usually one of two things. Analog distortion being the good one, and digital distortion being the bad one. An example of analog distortion is a magnetic tape saturation. An example of digital distortion is pushing your preamp too hot and having your input signal clip and distort. I guess we could say bad, because we like that kind of distortion a lot, right? JST clip vibes. The true meaning of distortion refers to electrical components. When the incoming signal is too much for a circuit, it chops it off. This is where we get into hard clipping. And we already said that even harmonics happen with soft clipping, right? So what type of harmonics do we get with distortion? Odd order harmonics. So take the same example we said before. If we have a sine wave at 200 Hertz with odd order harmonics, it will boost 200, 600, 1200 instead of 200, 400, and 600 like the even ones. So the definitive difference between saturation and distortion is saturation has harmonics due to soft clipping and is nonlinear, and distortion has odd harmonics due to hard clipping and is linear. I don't think this has been simplified in a sentence before. Another thing to note about what happens to the waveform of something that is hard clipped is it's flat instead of round and looks much more as though the peaks were simply shaved off. Distortion is mostly used on guitars, bass, vocals, occasionally drums, keyboard, so everything. Let's just go with everything. But now onto the most extreme of distortions that is usable, because we said that it is. Fuzz is such a ridiculous level of distortion that it was created accidentally by a broken mixer channel 60 years ago. It is the most aggressive form of distortion and the hardest level of clipping. This also means it's the most drastic use of odd order harmonics when it comes to distortion. Trying to keep this in your head. Even harmonics sound pleasant, odd harmonics don't. The more extreme the odd harmonic, the more traditionally unpleasant it's going to sound. The first use of this was on a guitar track on the song Don't Worry by Marty Robbins, but later on became an effect that would be associated with malfunctioning and broken gear because, well, that is where the sound actually came from. And of course, people love it in doom metal. I can't do it. Demon Fuzz by JST is actually a great example of a fuzz pedal that can give you the effect. What, am I not allowed to plug a plugin? It's literally in the name. Fuzz is mostly used on guitars and bass. So let's go over these again. Saturation, pleasant even harmonics, soft clipping, nonlinear. Overdrive, mostly guitar-based, more pronounced even harmonics, soft clipping, also non-linear. Distortion, odd harmonics, hard clipping, linear. Fuzz, mostly guitar-based, more pronounced odd harmonics, hard clipping. Glad that we were able to finally get to an understanding of saturation versus distortion. These terms can get really confusing because in the audio world, terms get tossed around, misused, and then become fact. But that's okay, because that's why we're here, to get to the bottom of this. And I find that it's truly important to understand the meaning of all the tools that you are working with. The result might be the same whether you realize it or not, but having the proper terminologies can help to better convey what you are trying to say to your clients and to your peers. If you're an engineer on the come up, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. You only have to do it one time. And tap that bell for notifications so when a video drops, you know the location. Until next time, I'm out of here. Just kidding, man. We all saw what happened with this Rode NT3 last time. Later.